So, it's the year 2025. We all know the 16/17 Daedric princes, right? Azura, Queen of Dusk and Dawn, pretty easy. Dagon, the Prince of Destruction, popular right now with the Oblivion remaster. Mora, the All-Seeing Eye. Ithelia, the Daedric Prince of... Wait. Ithelia? What the f... Welcome to another episode of me ranting and raving about Elder Scrolls cosmology. I'm glad you could join me. This month we'll be talking about the Daedric Princes, and I've got a lot to say about them. Just as a blanket statement, this video will contain spoilers for the Elder Scrolls Online, specifically the Necrom and Gold Road chapters, and it will contain spoilers for the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion's Shivering Isles DLC, which is something that's crazy for me to have to warn about spoilers in the year 2025, but with the Oblivion remaster having just dropped, I don't want to ruin anyone's day. So, I've wanted to make a video about Ithelia for a while, but I'd never played ESO's Necrom or Gold Road chapters, so I felt like I was morally obligated to finish those expansions before I said anything, because you can only learn so much by just reading summaries of the plots on UESP. So, very recently, on the channel, I tortured myself by playing through those plot lines on a livestream. It was excruciatingly painful, and probably the worst $30 I've ever spent on anything in my life, but I am at least very thankful for those of you who joined me on that quest. In investigating Ithelia, I realized that I had a lot more to say than I'd initially thought. Not just about her, mind you, but speaking broadly of all of the Daedric princes. Generally speaking, this lore video will be about concerns that I have about the representation of the Daedric princes, and how I think Elder Scrolls Online has sort of lost the plot in many ways, and is officially on my shit list now from a lore perspective. So, thanks, ESO. I guess. I will highly recommend that you watch my tower lore video before this one, as an understanding of the Orbis and the spokes is going to be necessary to comprehend for parts of this video. A link to the tower video will be in the description. I will also be spouting opinions in this video, more so than usual, because it seems like with all the muddled lore about Daedric entities, there's no longer any truth to a lot of statements, just endless conjecture. This video will be a little bit all over the place. We'll be talking about the original 16 Daedra and the importance of the number 16 in Elder Scrolls, the place that the Daedric realms hold in the cosmos, the difference between a princedom and a pocket realm. We'll talk about the 5 Daedric princes that we know are canonically younger than the rest. We'll talk about other Daedric entities that have cropped up over time. We'll touch on what an Ur-Dra is, and the representation of the Daedra in ESO. So, very much a mixed bag, somewhat of an omnibus of Daedric discussion, but I'll try my best to relate it all back to one another. So we're all on the same page here. In very simple terms, in the Elder Scrolls there are Ur-Dra and Daedra. Ur-Dra translates to ancestors, whereas Daedra translates to not our ancestors. So an Ur-Dra is an entity that assisted the being known as Lorcan in creation, and a Daedra is one who did not. So this is a list of the known Daedric princes thus far. Azura, Boethia, Clavicus Vile, Mora, Hircine, Ithelia, Jigalag, Malakath, Dagon, Mephala, Meridia, Molag Bal, Namira, Nocturnal, Periite, Sanguine, Sheogorath, and Vermina. And for those of you keeping track at home, that's 18. However, there have firmly been 16 Daedric realms that have been ruled by princes for many, many, many years. It's a cosmological fact about the universe itself, according to some sources, but according to a handful of fans, there are, and I quote, literally innumerable lords. This is a total misreading of the text, but we'll get into that later. Suffice it to say, this misreading has caused somewhat of a confusing split in the lore community regarding the number of Daedric realms and princes. Is it 16? Can it be more? Should it be more? Personally, I don't think so. So let's jump in and talk about why I don't like more realms being added. There are 16 Daedric realms currently ruled over by Daedric princes. Moonshadow, Attribution's Share, the Fields of Regret, Apocrypha, the Hunting Grounds, Ashpit, the Deadlands, the Spiral Skein, the Colored Rooms, Cold Harbor, the Scuttling Void, Evergloam, the Pits, the Myriad Realms of Revelry, the Shivering Isles, and Quagmire. Outside of these princely realms, we know of 2 realms that previously belonged to princes but no longer do. Fargrave is a Daedric realm that used to belong to Prince Ithelia prior to her banishment, which used to be called Mirrormoor, and Deadlight is a piece of an old realm that is said to have been previously occupied by a forgotten Daedric prince. The common two contenders for who Deadlight belonged to are Jyggalag and Ithelia. I believe Deadlight was likely a piece of Mirrormoor since 1. It literally can't be Jyggalag's because his realm is the Shivering Isles, and 2. Jyggalag was never truly forgotten.
For millennia this drama has unfolded, and each time I have conquered this land, only to be transformed back into that gibbering fool, Sheogorath. It was not always so. Once I ruled this realm, a world of perfect order. My dominion expanded across the seas of Oblivion with each passing era. The other princes, fearful of my power, cursed me with madness, doomed me to live as Sheogorath, a broken soul reigning in a broken land. Once each era, I was allowed my true form, conquering this world anew. And each time I did, the curse was renewed, damning me to exist as Sheogorath.
However, the events of the Shivering Isles DLC separated Jyggalag from Sheogorath, creating two distinct Daedric princes at once, a Prince of Order and a Prince of Madness. And that's the story of Jyggalag. But again, more to my point, Jyggalag was never truly forgotten.
Following each cycle of the Grey March, Sheogorath has cast out or killed every aspect of order found in the Shivering Isles.
Like Dias says there, Jyggalag's followers were killed off or banished, and because it happened a very long time ago, many people just don't remember him in the modern day. But that does not mean forgotten, not in the same way as Ithelia at least. Jyggalag was simply transmogrified into Sheogorath so long ago that modern people in Tamriel don't know much about him. But he is still known, and not just by people, but other beings as well. His name appears in 2 books. On Oblivion is one of them, as is the poem called Darkest Divinities. And of course there is Dias, Sothasil, Sirta, Haskell, Talimrend, Fanuiten, Sheogorath, and all of the other Daedric princes who know of him at the very least as well. So, Jyggalag was not truly forgotten. In fact, he seems to almost be a cautionary tale for Daedric princes taking things too far. To quote Fanuiten, "I have ambitions, of course, like every Ada, but I keep them within my sphere, lest I suffer the same fate as you know who." But in Ithelia's case, Hermaeus Mora literally pulls a Spider-Man No Way Home and, using a bullshit magic spell, makes everyone forget about Ithelia, then banishes her to another reality. The Gold Road chapter is insane. Hermaeus Mora and the Vestige from ESO are then the only 2 people who supposedly remember anything about Ithelia. From that, the reason I think that Deadlight was likely part of Mirrormoor rather than its own realm entirely is because in the Legend of Deadlight we hear this quote, "But he found that this unknown plane was only a shattered shard, a mere remnant of some previous realm that had been subjected to a terrible calamity. A few hours' march brought him to the jagged edges, where this sad fragment met the seas of Oblivion, and there was no way back." It seems like Deadlight is a fraction of a previous realm, rather than a whole one in and of itself, since we somehow are able to come to the jagged edges where the fragment meets the seas of Oblivion. We know also from the Elder Scrolls official novels as well that it is possible for a piece of Oblivion to be removed from its host plane and supplanted elsewhere, as is the case with Umbriel. I see no reason that this could not be the same case given the description provided. Considering that we already have a forgotten prince in the lore now, I would say this is the most likely scenario. In fact, it's possible that the ESO devs were teeing up the idea of Ithelia by introducing Deadlight first. I've heard others posit that there might be another secret Daedric prince whose realm this may have been, and you're free to believe that if you like, but I don't think so. We hear from Madam Wim in the Malakath and Maelstrom Loremasters archive that the prince is the realm is the prince, and any notion of separating the two is a farce. You need merely observe the ruin that is Fargrave to see what occurs when a Daedric power is removed from the ethereal equation. It is a rare event indeed, but it does happen. So, much like Fargrave, which is now desolate and was also once a piece of Mirrormoor, I think it's likely that Deadlight is too. I don't know what Ithelia would have done to have incited Mehrunes Dagon to attack Mirrormoor, but maybe Hermaeus Mora coerced him into doing it, as he says that most Daedric princes allied with him. I don't know though, a lot of Deadlight's lore is whataboutism. Either way, I personally find Deadlight to be uninteresting, purposeless, and I think it's another example of the ESO writers doing too much without thinking about it. Then of course, there are other Oblivion realms too that are not ruled by Daedric princes. These are called pocket realms, or sometimes sub-realms, as they can exist within other slices of Oblivion, so to speak. There are supposedly some 37,000 plus realms of Oblivion, according to Lawrence Schick in the Daedra dossier Cold Flame Atronach, and this is corroborated by Fa Nui Ten in a Loremaster's archive. Over 37,000! There are more than that in the Ur-Mora Clarion region alone. But most are too strange for mortal comprehension. You're better off just thinking about those planes associated with the princes, demi-princes, and Daedra lords, as those all partake of concepts that are at least somewhat familiar to you. Some of these realms are smaller parts of the larger princely realms, like I said, whereas some others are completely independent places like the Soul Cairn of the Ideal Masters. The catch-all term Pocket Realm may apply to any minor plane of Oblivion, whether linked to the major planes of a Daedric prince or not, that is, whether incorporated, semi-autonomous, or autonomous. The princes themselves are, almost by definition, quite distinct and different from each other, each with his or her own ideas of hierarchy and allegiance. So their methods of managing their realms, sub-realms, and pocket realms vary wildly. A major Oblivion plane is an expression of its prince's very nature. But these pocket realms and sub-realms do not necessarily matter for the purposes of this discussion. It is, however, interesting to point out that, according to the out-of-game text labeled Cosmology, planes are said to have an infinite mass and infinite size, and this is said to apply to all planets and planes which are one and the same. So it does beg an interesting question when it comes to how a pocket realm can be smaller than the princely realm when both are infinite in size and scale. And also, how can Deadlight have an edge if it's a realm that's supposed to be infinite? That's just stupid. Anyway, the reason that I bring up all of this is because of the model of the universe that was given to us by Vivek. If you've seen my Tower Lore video, then you'll be familiar with the two texts I'm about to bring up. Sermon 21 of Vivek's 36 Lessons and The Thief Goes to Cyrodiil, which is essentially an out-of-lore version of Sermon 21 that's a bit easier to comprehend. In both of these texts, Vivek tells us that Oblivion is divided into 16 princely realms. The language that he uses specifically is, "The spokes of the wheel are the 8 gifts of the Daedra, sons and daughters of Aetherius. The voids between each spoke number 16, and their masters are the sons and daughters of Oblivion." Sermon 21 is split into 8 parts, and part 4 then tells us very similarly that the spaces between the gift limbs number 16, the signal shapes of the demon Princedoms. It is the key and the lock, Ceres and Manticore. In Sermon 29 of Vivek's 36 Lessons, named The Scripture of the Numbers, number 4 is called the House of Troubles, another reference to Daedric beings, and perhaps a callback to part 4 of Sermon 21. Number 16 cited is called the Acceptable Blasphemies, which is a reference to the Pocket Guide to the Empire 1st edition, which I'll show on screen now, that stated this: the 8 invocations and the 16 acceptable blasphemies, and then went on to list the 8 spokes and the 16 Daedric princes. Now, this is like Morrowind-aged lore, very old stuff, written by Michael Kirkbride. And what it's all saying is that the 16 demon princedoms, or the 16 princely realms, are somehow important to the universe, as he describes them as the key and the lock, Ceres and Manticore. I'll touch more on this later, but I do want to show you the 16 motif continued as well. Outside of Kirkbride, we also have The Truth in Sequence now, written by Lehman Tuttle from Elder Scrolls Online. In Volume 3 of The Truth in Sequence, Sotha Sil's doctrine goes on to explain. Where others see dark crowns numbered 10 and 6, Sotha Sil sees shadows and nothing more, for the Daedra are the lie that creation tells itself. The sum of 10 and 6 being the important thing to point out here, which if you passed kindergarten, you'll realize is the number 16. That's 2 gods now, False gods, to be fair, but gods nonetheless, who have confirmed that there are 16 princes. To get even wilder, a few lines before the one I just read proves that Sothasil knew who Jyggalag was, as he name-drops the Grey Prince of Order. Again, Jyggalag was not forgotten. Yet Sothasil still refers to there only being 16 princes despite knowing who this Grey Prince of Order was. This is because, prior to the events of the Shivering Isles DLC, Sheogorath and Jyggalag were one and the same entity. And before Ithelia was sloppily written into the lore, Sothasil would have been totally correct in stating that there were only 16 princes. There's a couple more references to the number 16 that we can cite in regards to the Daedric princes as well, such as Fa Nuit Hen's Loremaster's Archive, which we'll get into later, the 16 Accords of Madness, a book series which contains myths of Sheogorath interacting with the other Daedric princes, 1 copy per prince, and the Ordinator Edict Mandate 16, which denotes that Daedra worship was prohibited under tribunal law, 16 being an interesting and relevant number to use when discussing Daedra. The number also serves a symbolic purpose here as well. The number 8 in Elder Scrolls is a divine number. Literally, it's the number of the original divines in the Mundus alongside a handful of other things. If 8 is a holy number then, what is 16? I'll quote from Thoughts on the Sacred Numbers for a moment here. As I sit here in the perfection of this garden, I contemplate the sacred numbers that we recognize as auspicious and critical to the existence of the universe. 3 is the number of the prime celestials, as embodied in the sun and the 2 moons. It is also the number of my perfect daughters, which is why we shall produce no other heirs. 5 is the number of the elements, for reality consists of earth, air, water, fire, and aether. It is also the number of books I have open upon my desk at any given time. 8 is the number of the planets, as well as the sum of 3 plus 5. 8 is also the limit I impose when drinking glasses of gossamer tawny port with the members of my philosophical society. No more and no less. These are the good numbers, and the sum of the good numbers, which we call 16, is a very powerful number indeed. We must beware the bad number, though, for 2 lacks vision and attempts to display duality, which we all know is impossible. I could honestly do an entire video just dedicated to sacred numbers and numerology in Elder Scrolls, but we're going to keep things relatively simple here by just focusing on 16 and 8. 16, as a multiple of 8, does one thing immediately in your brain, subtextually. It creates the image of more princes, and in most people's minds, more princes would equal more power. On a surface level, it immediately relates something to you. Now that's not to say that the divines are weak. Obviously, Mehrunes Dagon gets absolutely cooked by the Avatar of Akatosh, but a Daedric prince has access to all the power of their realms, whereas the Ur-Dra, not so much, since they lent much of their power to create Mundus. Also, if we're to take Thoughts on the Sacred Numbers as factually true, then 16 is the sum of 3 plus 5 plus 8, but it is likewise also 8 times 2, 8 being the number of planets, aka the divines, multiplied by the evil number of 2, which represents impossible duality. So again, 16 is important. Looping back to Sermon 21, these 16 realms are said to be located in between the realms of the 8 divines, and we know that these are the Princedoms because we're told that they're the ones ruled over by demon lords. Now, as of Oblivion, since around 2007, we have had 17 canonical Daedric princes, since Jyggalag was set free and the hero of Kvatch took the title of Mad God. So why am I seemingly okay with this and not Ithelia? Well, importantly, Jyggalag doesn't have a realm anymore. Sheogorath's realm, the Shivering Isles, was originally the Realm of Order, whose first name is unknown.
It was not always so. Once I ruled this realm, a world of perfect order. My dominion expanded across the seas of Oblivion with each passing era.
So when we all got jiggy with it and mantled Sheogorath, it was no big deal because it didn't mess with the cosmological order. Jyggalag takes his leave of his old realm at the end of the expansion, claiming that he is going to roam Oblivion from now on.
Now, though, you have ended the cycle. You now hold the mantle of madness, and Jigalag is free to roam the voids of Oblivion once more. I will take my leave, and you will remain here, mortal. Mortal, king, god, it seems uncertain. This realm is yours. Perhaps you will grow to your station. Fare thee well, Sheogorath, Prince of Madness.
Presumably, he's in a weakened state since his original realm is under Sheogorath's control now, and he's taking up residency in an unoccupied realm elsewhere. Kind of like Thanos at the end of Infinity War. Who knows, though? In 2019, Andrew Griffiths, a community content manager at Bethesda, told us that it's true Jigalag has separated from Sheogorath, but I'd say it's incorrect there is no longer an association. This is because he's fundamentally still tied somewhat to his realm, since it is part of his essence and being. But since he's been kicked out, there are other realms he could be residing in that are not his. There are regions of incomplete and half-finished demiplanes, the so-called inchoate realms, that were for some reason abandoned by their projectors, dangerous places for even powerful Daedra to visit, and it's easy to become discorporated in a Roamver ambush, or by getting caught up in a realm rip. Then there are what we call the Sundered Realms, pocket realities that were shattered by interplanar war or princely expungement. Regardless, Jigalag's entry into the series was a very interesting way to integrate a new prince to the players without messing up the entire established order of the universe. Ithelia, on the other hand, introduces a new problem to the mix. By adding in the 17th realm of Mirrormore, and potentially an 18th realm if they make up a new prince for Deadlight eventually, the Elder Scrolls Online developers have thrown away any significance that the original writers may have had for the number 16 and the cosmic metaphysics of the universe. Decades of pre-established lore, subtext, and symbolism gone with the stroke of a pen. And the craziest thing of all is that no one asked them to add a new Daedric prince. They really didn't have to do that. Before we end this section, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you a theory that I landed on to explain away the contradictions here. I don't think it really works, but it might sound like it works for a second here. So when Talos ascended and became the 9th Daedra, becoming/replacing Lorcan, adding another spoke to the wheel, the Princedoms of Oblivion doubled to 18, making way for the Daedric Prince of Deadlight and Ithelia's Mirrormore to fit into the cosmological equation. However, as we've already talked about, this doesn't quite work for me, as it doesn't work within the wheel analogy, but even if we were going off this theory, it still doesn't work because Talos did not ascend until near the beginning of the Third Era, and all of this lore here with Ithelia was ages and ages prior. You could cope even further and say that Talos was retroactively always a god, just like how Cyrodiil was always temperate, but you'd be, kind of stretching with that in my opinion. I'm totally content, personally, to just say that this is stupid and an oversight and move on with my day, but to each their own. I can already hear keyboards clicking, though, and telling me that since Daggerfall, Jigalag was introduced in the book On Oblivion as a 17th backup prince, so the number 16 was never intended to be anything other than an arbitrary number, right? Well, the exact quote here from Bethesda game designer and writer Ted Peterson in 2001 states that Jigalag was thrown into On Oblivion to add an additional Daedra prince in case we needed one down the road for, the Daedra of poisons or unattractive hairdos. My response with this in mind is twofold. Like what Ted Peterson said here, Jigalag was an extra reference in case they needed it. The way they wound up using him, again, did not disturb the balance of the cosmos. 2. The in-universe author of On Oblivion, Morian Zenas, was a Daedric explorer and master of conjuration. He'd likely come across the name Jigalag before, but didn't know that he was cursed to be Sheogorath. As I've established, Jigalag was never forgotten, but was simply hard to find. Zenas also states in On Oblivion this quote that I think has people confused.
The Daedra princes whose names appear over and over in ancient records, though this is not an infallible test of their authenticity or explicit existence to be sure, are the aforementioned Sanguine, Boethia, Molig Ball, and Sheogorath, and in addition, Azura, Mephala, Clavicus Vile, Vernima, Malakath, Hormeus, or Hermaeus, or Hermias, or Herma, There seems to be no one accepted spelling. Mora, Namira, Jigalag, Nocturnal, Mehrunes Dagon, and Periite. In the beginning there, when he says this is not an infallible test of their authenticity or explicit existence, he's not trying to say that more princes exist that he hasn't heard of. He's trying to say that this list that he has here is not infallible, meaning he could have gotten something wrong, which he did by confusing Jigalag and Sheogorath as separate entities. Mori and Xenos, at the time of writing this list, also didn't even know who Hircine was, which was an intentional choice by the writers, as we can see using Ted Peterson's quote. So I don't think that On Oblivion points to there being more princes than the ones listed. It's a possible interpretation, but I think it's an unlikely one. The only things that I've seen to suggest that there are many princes out there in Oblivion are all sources from ESO, which of course contradict other sources from ESO, believe it or not. For those who don't know, the Loremaster's Archive was a series that began through ZeniMax, and it's essentially a place where fans can send in questions to in-universe characters, kind of like an interview, and then the writers will pretend to be those characters and respond to the questions accordingly. There were 2 Fanuit Hen interviews where Lawrence Schick played the character. For those who don't know, Fanuit Hen is a Daedric demi-prince, the scion of Boethia, and Lawrence Schick was the original Loremaster for ESO. There are 2 write-in questions from fans that I think have people really confused. See, I like to do lots of research before I come to my conclusions in these videos, and in preparation for this video, I asked this question in the UESP Discord in their lore channel. Hey, writing a new piece on Daedric realms and lords. I've seen people claim that there are possibly other Daedric princes outside of the regular 16/17/18. Where does this claim come from? I got a response 5 minutes later from a user whose name I'll obscure, which stated, Fanuit Hen Loremaster's Archive. So I was led here, and I found these 2 seemingly contradictory quotes. In the first interview, the final question is from a fan pretending to be an in-universe scholar. Their question was as follows. To Fanuit Hen, courtesy of the Loremaster. I was intrigued to hear that the Maelstrom Arena is considered an Oblivion pocket realm. One of yours, I assume? I have always had an interest in pocket realms, being that there is so little documentation about them in existing scholarly works. Some sources say there are over 37,000. The monomyth states how the 16 Daedric princes created the Daedric realms and all the ranks of Lesser Daedra, great and small. So I was wondering, how do the pocket realms fit into the Daedric hierarchy? Does every pocket realm belong originally to one of the 16 princes? And what this fan is referring to here is the Cyrodiilic creation myth titled Shezer's Song that's present in the monomyth. But interestingly, it never says 16. The direct quote from the monomyth is, So the Daedra lords created the Daedric realms, and all the ranks of Lesser Daedra, great and small. But Lawrence Schick still responded to this question legitimately without correcting that there are many other Daedric princes. He actually seemed fine with the language of 16 princes, in fact, but did not address it. In the second interview, a fan pretending to be an ancestor of Sabile Stentor from the College of Winterhold sent in this question.
In all of my research of the various planes of Oblivion, I have come across no clarification on one particular matter of Daedric politics. What is it that makes a prince a prince? Lord Fanuit Hen is of course a demi-prince by virtue of parentage, or so I have it from recorded correspondence with Lyranth, and there are literally innumerable Daedric lords, but what sets a prince apart from the rest? Is it something inherent to their nature, or is it more of a station occupied?
Now, we'll come back to this text block again, as the response is important, but to the point of the question, the asker, Silbarius Stentor, posits that there are innumerable lords, and this is not challenged either. Lawrence Schick makes no attempt to say that there are in fact innumerable, or there are in fact 16. But I think I've realized the confusion here. Silbarius Stentor here made reference to Fanuit Hen as a Daedric lord, and he's right in saying that he is. There are many minor yet still powerful Daedric entities that classify themselves as lords. To put it simply, all Daedric princes are Daedric lords, but not all Daedric lords are Daedric princes. So to clarify my position here, I don't think the asker of this question meant to suggest that there were innumerable Daedric princes. I think they were referring to the many Daedra lords who rule over their subplanes. It just gets tricky because Daedric lords and Daedric princes are often synonymous with one another. But if you really break the syntax of the question down, it makes more sense in light of this. There are literally innumerable Daedric lords, but what sets a prince apart from the rest is the key phrasing here, as it separates the idea of being a prince with the idea of being just a lord. So I hope I've been clear in my interpretation of this passage here. And 5 years after this interaction, we got further clarification from a different Loremaster's archive from Michael Zenke, who replaced Lehman Tuttle, who replaced Lawrence Schick. In the Infinite Archive Loremaster's archive, Michael Zenke said this: Thoat occupies that rarefied space near the top of Daedric society, just one rung down from the princes themselves. She is a Daedric lord, and like many lords, no doubt has a realm all her own somewhere in the infinite void that swirls beyond. While there are only a few handfuls of princes, there are dozens of Daedric lords known to mortal scholars, and a potentially infinite amount who have yet to interact with a person with enough forethought to write the experience down. So there you have it. Princes are different from lords, even though they're synonymous sometimes, and there are only a few handfuls of princes. Before we move on from this section, just to be thorough, because I'm sure someone will bring it up, there was an official interview that took place around 2007 called The Interview with Two Denizens of the Shivering Isles. In this interview, Bethesda Game Studios staff members Kurt Coleman and Bruce Nesmith role-played as the characters of Haskell and Dias for the purposes of the interview. As Haskell, when asked a question about Dark Seducers serving Mehrunes Dagon, this quote was offered as a response. "How typical. You mortals love to take a pebble of information and construct entire realms of conjecture upon it. Your lore of those disparate beings that you lump together as Daedra is based on nothing. Lies and half-truths told by traitors, rebels, miscontents, and weaklings who have had the misfortune to become involved with mortals. Or with Mehrunes Dagon. Do not speak his name to me again. The master of scum, the pawn of every prince of true power, the dupe of every schemer in the 19 voids. Do you think you know anything of the politics, factions, feuds, vendettas, wars of Oblivion?" Here we have the mention of the 19 voids, which is a rather undefined term, but I've seen it presented before as an absolute fact by people that there are 19 Daedric realms. And yes, the terms Void and Oblivion are sometimes used to mean the same thing, like when the Pocket Guide to the Empire 3rd edition refers to Oblivion as the Void of Oblivion. However, it's infrequent and inaccurate to say the Void and Oblivion are one and the same. So, could Haskell have been referring to 19 Daedric realms? I don't think so personally, but I genuinely have no clue. It would fit within the context of the rest of the paragraph, but I have to tell you, this has literally never been followed up on again since this out-of-game interview, so I hold its lore relevancy fairly low, but who knows, I could be wrong. I don't know what 19 voids are, is my point with this, and I think that anyone who proclaims they do know what the 19 voids are is being disingenuous. The people at UESP have linked the 19 voids comment in this interview directly to the page about the voids itself, not to Oblivion, which I'm not using as evidence to support my case, but rather as evidence to show that I'm not alone in thinking this could just be about the void. So, there you have it. I've never seen compelling evidence that supports the idea of there being vastly more Daedric princes or realms in the universe than the ones we already know of. I also asked a question to the lovely folks on r/testlore about this, and I received a response from Reddit user Mathemagix15, who said this: "I've never encountered any suggestion that there are many unknown princes to mortals. Ithelia is clearly treated as an exceptionally special case, so why should there be many more of her kind out there? I personally doubt it. What there are a lot of in Oblivion are realms whose masters, if there are any, are not recognized as Daedric princes, either because they aren't at Ada or are simply insufficiently powerful." And honestly, couldn't have said it better myself. Speaking of Ithelia though, we do need to talk about her and a couple other Daedric princes as well. Let's start with the elephant in the room here. For the uninitiated, Ithelia is the Daedric Prince of Paths, which means that she can see alternate realities. Basically, her whole thing is that she's the Daedric prince of the multiverse, linking her somewhat to the Unbound Prisoners, which are the player characters throughout the series, since player characters have free will and ultimately can save and reload their games, making different decisions and setting themselves on these alternate paths. And conceptually, I think this is a really cool idea to investigate further. However, if you think Ithelia is cool, that does not mean you have to be okay with what they did with her. I'll just summarize what happened in Necrom and the Gold Road for you. Hermaeus Mora, essentially, saw that Ithelia's fate was to bring about the destruction of our reality, and, through conspiring with the other Daedric princes, sought to imprison her, which they did, but then she got let out, and then she threw a temper tantrum and actually tried to end reality because of what Hermaeus Mora did in a self-fulfilling prophecy type of sense. Then she realized she was being a meaniehead, and she turned herself into Hermaeus Mora, where she agreed to open a gateway to an alternate reality where Magne-Ge didn't exist, and she banished herself there, never to return.
A path where Daedra and Magne-Ge do not exist. It would need to be a place where my Daedric power held no sway and could gain no foothold.
So, she's presumably selling makeup at Sephora in some mundane world now, and Hermaeus Mora did a Men in Black flashy thing to the entire population of the universe, or our universe, because the multiverse is canon now, so no one remembers her and she's just out of the lore forever. But her realm remains. I can't describe how bad this DLC was. For one, how does one open a magic portal to a realm where magic doesn't exist? Stupid. It was pointless in the end, as well, and only served to muddle the existing lore really, really badly. For instance, once to stop another Ithelia from a different reality coming into the Elder Scrolls Prime universe, as it were, and doing the exact same thing.
This plot is stupid anyway. Honestly, it doesn't deserve critical thought, because the one thing that I'm thinking now is that what if an Ithelia from a different path sees that there's this universe that doesn't have an Ithelia in it, and then they can just come in and basically blitzkrieg the other Daedra and blow up this reality. Because no one's going to be expecting an Ithelia from a different path. Like, removing this one Ithelia from this path does not move the infinite other number of Ithelias in the other paths.
That's right, nothing. There's absolutely nothing stopping that from happening. Before I go on a mega rant, I'll rein myself in. If you do want to hear me unhinged at any point, feel free to stop by on one of my live streams. I do them right here on YouTube, and I'm much less filtered and much more stupid, to be honest with you. Getting back on track, though, now that you know the story of Ithelia, you should also know that there is nothing about Ithelia's powers that necessitated her to be a Daedric being. And in fact, she was not one originally. Ithelia was a member of the Magne-Ge, and she was one of the 9 Coruscations, who were daughters of Magnus who separated from him as he fled Mundus. She was, to be precise, the leader of the 9 Coruscations, the Prime Archon. And if they really, really wanted this character to be a thing, they could have just kept her as a Magne-Ge. Because we've already done the whole Daedric princes teamed up on a prince thing with Jigalag, and we've already done the whole Magne-Ge to Daedra thing before with Meridia, her whole storyline was just a rehash of other plots. Meridia was also a member of the 9 Coruscations. She was known as Merid Nunda, and our boy, Lawrence Schick, thought about this lore and actually added something pretty neat. See, Meridia not being one of the original Daedra raises an interesting question. Where did she get her realm from? Well, again, Lawrence created some lore for the Colored Rooms, which I'll read now. The next passage was quite difficult, but its translation adds an entirely new episode to our accounts of the Dawn Era. The lords of the Chaos Realms chided Merid Nunda for her trespass and bade her return to Orbis, claiming all existing spheres as their own. But Merid Nunda formed of her substance a great drag lens, and the light of Magnus was bent thereby. The rays carved, focused, a new sphere from the chaos, which Merid Nunda, laughing, sparkling, did claim for her own. So there you have it. Meridia entered into Oblivion after departing from Magnus and forged a new realm during the Dawn Era, which makes some sense here because the Dawn Era was when time was still unfixed and things weren't put in place as firmly, as it were. The cosmos did not have a steady structure at this point. But this does then lead into further questions, right? I mean, we have 5 Daedric princes who weren't originally Daedric. Ithelia and Meridia we just covered, but Malakath, for example, used to be the Et Ada known as Trinimac before he was transmogrified into Malakath by Boethia. But his realm, known as Ashpit, has no foundational creation myth. Malakath is in fact the canonically youngest of the Daedric beings, having been created during the Merethic era. So what's going on with his realm? When was that created, and in what relation to the 8 divine realms and the other 15 realms? I guess importantly to this point, some orcs believe Trinimac and Malakath to be separate entities, but broadly it is accepted that they are the same. Perhaps Malakath's Ashpit was once the realm of Trinimac, supposing he had one within Mundus, that became corrupted over time, after his decline into Malakath. Displacement of his plane would be in line as well, since Malakath is the god of the spurned and ostracized. As such, Trinimac's realm being removed or ostracized from Mundus fits in line with his new position. The biggest gripe that I have within this story is that it happens during the Merethic era, after time had been established on Nirn properly. So the Daedric realms, theoretically, should have been in place already at this point. At least, that's what you would assume. However, Oblivion time and Akatosh time are not exactly one for one. Again, referring back to the Loremaster's archive, as for time, cause, and consequence, let's just say that the laws of the Dragon God do not apply to Oblivion. Oh, it's useful to adopt the trappings of duration when dealing with mortals, so you'll find Maelstrom quite familiar in that regard. We know how lost you feel away from the hand of Akatosh. So maybe, just maybe, things hadn't quite been aligned yet in Oblivion by the time that Malakath came to be. But I still think that is tenuous at best, and I would like to see an official statement on this at some point in the future, because I really don't like making excuses for things the writers should have already thought about. Maybe I'll have to send a question into the next Loremaster's archive, who knows. Let's shift off of Malakath, though, and onto the Mad God. Sheogorath is in a similar boat to Malakath, since he's a transmogrified being, but we already know that his realm was previously Jiggalag's realm, so that's no issue. However, Mehrunes Dagon is interesting since he's stated to have been created in the bowels of Lig by the Magne-Ge, as was laid out by Mankar Cameron in the commentaries on the Mysterium Xarxes, Volume 4.
I give my soul to the Magne-Ge, saith the joyous in paradise, for they created Mehrunes the Razor in secret, in the very bowels of Lig, the domain of the upstart who vanishes. Though they came from diverse waters, each get shared sole purpose, to artifice a prince of good, spinning his likeness in random swath, and imbuing him with Oblivion's most precious and scarce asset, hope.
If Mankar Cameron is to be believed, that would make Dagon also not a Daedric prince. And there's another one of Mankar's theories that we should look over if we're doing a thorough investigation. According to Mankar Cameron's doctrine, Lorcan was the Daedric Prince of Change, whose realm used to be Tamriel, or Nirn, until he was betrayed by the Daedra and dethroned from his princely position. If you'd like a more thorough investigation into Mankar Cameron and his beliefs, I have a video linked below that will take you there. Cameron's viewpoints sound enticing, however, I find their canonicity to be questionable at best, and this is the same reason that I said Mehrunes Dagon's creation in Lig is also questionable. We'd have to take the entirety, or at least most of the commentaries on the Mysterium Xarxes at face value if we decide to adopt these viewpoints. And there's some disparity between the idea of Lorcan being an Daedra or being a Daedra. I've always seen him as a bit of both, actually. According to some pantheons, Lorcan is also referred to as the missing god or the spirit of Nirn in a more Daedric sense. Looking back to Sermon 29, number 9 in the list is titled as the Missing, which is of course a nod to Lorcan being the supposed ninth deity in Mundus. But in my eyes, this again does not upset the balance of the universe. We said that the Daedric realms are in between the spokes, and the idea here is that a ninth god would imply another ninth spoke. However, Mundus is the hub of the orbis, of the cosmic wheel, and within that wheel of Mundus there is another hub, which is Nirn, the plane of Lorcan. The 8 divines stabilize the universe in this order, and their spokes are said to protrude outward from Mundus in a metaphysical sense. The central part of a wheel is the connection point then. The hub, therefore, can have no spokes because ontologically, categorically, It is the very thing that the spokes themselves are supporting. I hope that makes sense. My point being here is that if Lorcan was a Daedra, then his realm is of no concern because it's not in Oblivion, and if he was an Aedra, then his realm is of no concern because it is the central point and does not introduce another spoke to the wheel, so to speak. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this though. I could totally be wrong about my interpretation here, but I feel pretty confident in it. If we disregard Lorcan though and get back on track, Mehrunes Dagon, Meridia, Sheogorath, Ithelia, and Malakath were all late additions to the party, proverbially speaking. And in fact, there do seem to be ages attributed with some of the princes, as we hear the term Ur-Dra used frequently when talking about Nocturnal. This title of Ur is often recognized as representing the oldest and in some cases most powerful of a given category. Think of Dagoth-Ur, for example. The title of Ur likely stems from the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, that was located in the Mesopotamian region. Just a fun fact. Ur-Dra then would mean the oldest and most powerful Daedra, and this makes sense with Nocturnal since her sphere is darkness. The term Ur-Dra also rises when the Khajiit speak about Namira, and in a few instances, Azura and Boethia have been associated with the title as well. Hermaeus Mora also makes an offhanded comment referring to himself as an Ur-Daedra specifically, which could be related to Ur-Dra or it might be its own thing.
I am Ur-Daedra, the one who knows. I see infinite possibilities arrayed before me, but not necessarily the final path.
So if we can have young and old Daedra, it makes sense that their realms can have ages too, because, as we've established at this point, the realm is the Daedra and the Daedra is the realm. But that does lead to a natural question. What makes a Daedric prince? What makes a prince a prince? A broad and well-defined sphere of influence that enables clarity of purpose and focused expression of will. With that said, each of the princes, methods of managing their realms, sub-realms, and pocket realms vary wildly. A major Oblivion plane is an expression of its prince's very nature, so to say that each craves absolute control of his or her sphere is inexact, as a desire for absolute control is not central to every prince's nature. And this gets further into what we call mimics, which are essentially the blueprints which determine how Daedric entities manifest and reconstitute upon death. Basically, a mimic is a Daedric entity's secret name that defines how a Daedra acts and behaves, so it makes sense that each Daedra would operate their realms in varying, distinct ways. It is interesting the different groupings of Daedric entities that we have throughout the series. Of course, we have the House of Troubles, which is a Dunmeri grouping of Sheogorath, Malakath, Molag Bal, and Mehrunes Dagon. These Daedra are not to be trusted by the Dunmer, but according to them, Azura, Boethia, and Mephala are supposed three good Daedra. These Daedra are not to be trusted by the Dunmer, but also according to them, Azura, Boethia, and Mephala, the supposed three good Daedra, are entirely fair game. The Altmer, on the other hand, stave off all types of interaction with Daedric entities, who they see as others, preferring instead to worship the Aedra, whom they view as ancestors. As we discussed previously, the Imperials are not so stringent. Publicly, they worship the 8 and 1, but see the 16 Daedra as acceptable blasphemies, at least according to the Pocket Guide to the Empire, 1st edition. The Khajiit have fully integrated Daedra into their belief system as well. Jiggalag and Sheogorath, as we mentioned before, existed as a pair of 2 in 1 for many untold centuries, which, if you remember back to the sacred numbers, 2 was considered to be a representation of impossible duality, perhaps why they needed to be split from one another eventually back into individuals. The Daedric Triad is another grouping of princes that came out with the Somerset expansion for ESO and was composed of Mephala, Nocturnal, and Clavicus Vile. I will rant about this later. Sothasil seems to have some grouping of Daedric entities into 10 and 6 if we look back to the Truth and Sequence Volume 3. I've thought for a really long time about what this could be in reference to, and I even sent a message to Lehman Tuttle on Reddit, but he never got back to me. To answer it though, let's take a look at the Cold Harbor Compact. The Compact was, and may still be, a grouping of 8 Daedra that agreed to not invade Tamriel after a meeting behind closed doors with the Clockwork God. The Daedra that agreed to the Concord are, interestingly, Azura, Boethia, Hermaeus Mora, Hirsine Malakath, Mehrunes Dagon, Molag Bal, and Sheogorath. After the events of ESO Somerset, Mephala and Clavicus Vile agreed to join a compact with Sotha Sil, though it's unclear if it was the Cold Harbor Compact. If it were, then that would make it an even 10-6 split. However, the Truth and Sequence Volume 3 was printed before Clavicus Vile and Mephala joined the compact, so I don't know. All members of the House of Troubles agreed to never invade Tamriel under this compact, yet Molag Bal and Mehrunes Dagon broke the pact several times, which is honestly in line with their mimics. We also have the 3 good Daedra in the Cold Harbor Compact after ESO Somerset as well, so it's a very interesting grouping of Daedric princes. On Oblivion also groups Mehrunes Dagon, Molag Bal, Periite, Boethia, and Vermina as the most demonic of the Daedra. My point with bringing all of these up is that there are certain Daedra that have things in common with one another, despite how disparate their realms or spheres may seem, and this could link back to similar Nimic groupings. So looking back at the Daedric realms with all of the knowledge that we've now gathered, we can take a look at the second half of Sermon 21's passage, so easily forgotten. The spaces between the gift limbs number 16, the signal shapes of the demon princedoms. It is the key and the lock, Ceres and Manticore. It is the key and the lock, Ceres and Manticore. I often leave this sentence off the end when I'm quoting this because it adds an esoteric message onto the back half of an already esoteric message. But what I've taken this to mean is that the Daedric realms possess some sort of knowledge that is obtainable through their study. Perhaps it is those very spheres, like Nocturnal's Night and Darkness, Sheogorath's Madness, and Vermina's Nightmares, to name a few, that one can become closer with. These would be the key and the lock, the ways in which you can open your mind to the hidden knowledge. And that hidden knowledge is described as Ceres and Manticore. A Ceres is obviously something that has been ordered in a certain way, and a Manticore is a mythological creature combined with many other parts of different animals. Essentially, chaos. What Vivek is telling us here is literally that the Daedric realms are ordered chaos. And if we take Ceres literally, we can understand that these realms come in a certain order. Likely with Evergloam being the first realm, with Nocturnal as the Ur-Dra, and Ashpit being the last, since it is the realm of Malakath, the newest Daedra. We know that the colored rooms were created at a certain point in time as well, so it stands to reason that the others could have been created at different times too. So not to beat a dead horse here, but I hope I've made it clear at this point that the Daedric realms have some sort of power in the universe. Through study of them, one can find in its ordered chaos a piece of individual truth offered through the realm. And we can even see this ourselves. People who enter Daedric realms seem to take something from them. Think of the guy at the beginning of the Shivering Isles that leaves the portal in a craze. He drank too much from the cup of madness and lost himself in Sheogorath's truth. So I hope by now I've been able to convince you that Ithelia is the most purely disrespectful creation that the Elder Scrolls Online has ever introduced. She's a thoughtless Daedric being that was ushered into the game and into the lore because ZeniMax needs to make a DLC for ESO every year. And when you're pumping out content like a leaky faucet, not everything is going to stick. In my opinion, Ithelia should have stayed a Magne-Ge, but instead, she's a Daedric prince, and her realm completely goofs up the symbolic cosmology. And honestly, I feel for Ithelia, because conceptually, a being whose sphere is free will is cool. But her removal from the Elder Scrolls universe is really dumb now, because essentially we're saying that the usher of free will has been removed entirely from existence. So, shouldn't free will fade too? The whole DLC is just very poorly thought out. I honestly think that the best solution at this point for her and her lore is to make some official retcons about this. If you've seen my Ideas for Elder Scrolls 6 video, you'll also be familiar with my idea to turn ESO's chapters into in-universe fiction books. I still like the idea, but I'm not in charge. And God forbid Bethesda take the Ithelia statue off their store. But she's not the only Daedric prince to get a rough treatment from ESO. There's a few more we need to talk about, alongside the nature of Daedric beings as a whole. So the Elder Scrolls Online has lost the plot, guys. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's true. They need to leave the Daedra alone. I'm completely sick of it at this point. The base game, of course, is all centered around Molag Bal trying to do what Mehrunes Dagon will later fail to do in the Third Era, which is of course to conquer Tamriel. Then from chapters 1 to 2 we followed the plotline of the Daedric Triad, which was, at the time, kind of neat, but in retrospect it's really stupid. We had Clavicus Vile, Mephala, and Nocturnal all team up to supposedly make the world a better place. Nocturnal then betrays Clavicus and Mephala, which is crazy because Mephala is the prince of deceit and murder, and Clavicus Vile is basically the Daedric prince of bad faith deals. But Nocturnal nonetheless betrays them, and she begins to take over the Crystal Tower to amplify her power across all realms. This is my Nocturnal rant, I'm sorry. Nocturnal, being the Ur-Dra, the primordial Daedra, has always, in my eyes, been sort of above the others. She's described to us time and time again as the most powerful Daedra of them all. So why is she teaming up with some other Daedric princes? That has always seemed way out of character to me. Nocturnal has always seemed to me to be a Daedra that enjoys her interactions with mortals, and she enjoys being alone. For starters, she's seen as a patron to thieves, not some typically destructive being like Mehrunes Dagon or Molag Bal. If you think back to the original thief of the Grey Cowl of Nocturnal, Emer Daraloth, reference, when he was able to steal her cowl, she didn't kill him. Instead, she cursed him and any others who would dare to put on the cowl. She has her Nightingales, which is a mortal task force, essentially, and they don't worship Nocturnal. Their relationship is more like a business. Her interactions with the Nightingales in Skyrim are also very conversational, very stern, but also a bit playful. Nocturnal also has a Khajiit myth about her, where it is stated that Noctra has aided the Khajiit when cold. Tribes may whisper to Noctra for silence, shade, and luck. So lots of lore about her interacting with mortals in a somewhat mischievous way, almost like she's playing with them or enjoying them. So when ESO has her betraying other princes and turns her into a mustache-twirling villain at the top of the Crystal Tower, without even updating her clothes from her last appearance in Skyrim, it's deeply upsetting. Nocturnal is my favorite Daedric prince, as I'm sure you can tell from the whole vibe of the channel, and I think this interpretation of her totally misunderstood her consistent characterization. Then we come to ESO Blackwood, where they straight up had Mehrunes Dagon invade Cyrodiil. Or Blackwood, really, but that's still part of Cyrodiil. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that Mehrunes Dagon is portrayed as a nuanced character in Oblivion, but there is some complexity with Dagon's realm that they had a chance to explore here. As the Daedric Prince of Destruction and Change, they could have leaned into the change aspect more, maybe had you team up with him for once or something, but no. The ESO devs took this opportunity to rehash the plot of Elder Scrolls 4. Deeply upsetting. Then you have Necrom, which totally misunderstands the entire character of Hermaeus Mora and the point of the Dragonborn DLC from Skyrim. Hermaeus Mora is your buddy in ESO, who anoints you as the Chosen One the first time that you meet him, and he swears an infallible oath that he will not deceive you.
It is for your peace of mind, mortal. I offer to bind myself, to give you the power to constrain my actions, so that you may trust me.
Hermaeus Mora in Necrom is the good guy. No trickery, no lust for knowledge, simply a nice dude trying to stop his realm from dying. Dumb as hell. Throughout the livestream, we were all complaining about his representation in ESO. It was monstrously bad. And then of course we come to Ithelia, which I don't feel the need to rehash, but they said something interesting in that DLC. They said that Daedric princes can't change, that they're statically stuck in their ways.
Change does not come naturally to the Daedric princes, not like it does for mortals.
Daedra don't change. Daedric princes especially. It's their nature. We're not like you mortals, constantly reflecting on possibilities and remaking yourselves over and over.
Which I kind of understand, because they were probably talking about Nimics and how the natures of Daedra can't change beyond their Nimic. But the way they went about explaining it was really dumb and steps on pre-established lore, a common theme now with ESO. I mean, for instance,
A change is coming. Everything changes, even Daedric princes, especially Daedric princes. Daedra are the embodiment of change and permanency. I'm no different, except in the ways that I am.
Daedric beings are literally birthed from Padme, the primordial essence of change. So saying that Daedric beings can't experience change is dumb. But then that leads into Nocturnal and Hermaeus Mora again. Why are they so vastly different in ESO if they're not supposed to be able to change? I also think it's dumb that they needlessly invented a new Daedric prince when we haven't really seen any big additions for princes like Sanguine, Peryite, Vermina, etc. Like, if you have to have a Daedric being as your storytelling vessel, then use one that's underdeveloped. Don't make Mehrunes Dagon invade Cyrodiil again. That's not interesting. And don't make up a new one if you're just going to reuse Jiggalag's plotline and Meridia's lore. The entire Ithelia plot could have actually been about Jiggalag instead, and it probably would have been better. But yeah, I'm just over it at this point. ESO, leave the Daedric princes alone. So what have we learned today? Well, we've learned that ZeniMax can't seem to handle writing for Daedric princes. So what do we do about the stuff that they've invented? Well, I think that we have two options going forward. The first option is that we take all of this as it stands at face value. Ithelia is the 18th Daedric prince, her realm is Mirrormore, and new lore can just step on the toes of the old lore. Who really cares? It's all up to individual interpretation. This option is obviously my least favorite. Because if we establish the precedent that lore and storytelling in this universe can just be disregarded, then officially the Elder Scrolls has lost my interest in many ways. Now, lore can be amended. I'm not saying that everything is or should always be set in stone. Jiggalag is actually my second favorite Daedric prince, up there with Nocturnal. I love his addition into the Pantheon. But again, it was a lore adaptation using a previously established name, and it was done tastefully without messing with the cosmological structure of the universe. But if we go with option 1, we're not expecting them to do anything tastefully anymore. Option 1 becomes acceptance, and with it, you must also own the contradictions with the previous lore. And you can spend hours and hours on end trying to rationalize the non-existent reasons that the devs decided to make the decisions that they did. I will say this clearly and firmly here. Not everything that a developer writes is good or needs to be respected. And as such, I offer you option 2. Option 2 is that we simply understand that this whole Ithelia thing was poorly done. Extremely poorly done. We accept that and we tell Bethesda Game Studios that they can do better. Elder Scrolls already has made major changes to the established lore as retcons through strange events. The most abrasive one by far is that of changing the entire climate and geography of Cyrodiil throughout space and time, aka the Cyrodiil Jungle Incident, where Bethesda decided that they wanted Cyrodiil to be a temperate climate zone, so they retconned all of the lore about Cyrodiil being a jungle and replaced it with some honestly wacky explanation. And if they're willing to do something like that, then I don't think it's a huge ask to have Ithelia fixed in the next game as well. Even if she's technically been permanently banished from existence, her realm remains. And I'll even write it for you right now. Here's one idea on how we fix Ithelia. We write that Ithelia was still the prime archon of the 9 Coruscations, but this time around, let's say that she was somehow tricked into believing herself to be a powerful Daedric prince. Maybe after she broke away from Magnus, she was lost in the void, and being detached from the light of Aetherius for so long, her memory began to dwindle, and she forgot who she was. Eventually, after a long period of time as a wanderer, she stumbled across one of the main princely realms. I like Mephala as the option here since she's the web spinner, and I could see her roping Ithelia into some sort of plot to serve her goals. Recognizing the prime archon of the 9 Coruscations, Mephala would not inform her of her rightful place among the Star Orphans. Rather, Mephala would purposefully mislead Ithelia, seeing her as a powerful ally. She'd refer to her as her sister and grant her a portion of her realm, the Spiral Skein, to serve as a faux realm. This would become the Plane of Mirrormore, which we can now say was not a new princely realm, but rather a pocket realm of an already established one. Ithelia from here begins referring to herself as a Daedric prince and gains some presence with the aliens of Cyrodiil. Eventually, Hermaeus Mora would catch on to the Prime Archon's existence in Mephala realm and stage an entire war against her, realizing that her sphere of multitudes and free will is a counter to his discipline of preordained fate. Mehrunes Dagon, described as the pawn of every prince of true power, would take little convincing in attacking Ithelia. Dagon, alongside several other princes, would raze Miramor, literally cleaving the plane in two, with deadlight resulting from the cataclysm. In the end, Hermaeus Mora captures and imprisons Ithelia just like in Necrom, and we have her broken out, just like in Gold Road. However, in her newfound freedom while wandering the Mundus, she views Magnus in the sky and begins to remember her past as the Prime Archon, and goes on a journey to reconnect with the other coruscations. This could lead to interesting plots going forward with the Magne-Ge, who have often been an underlooked part of the lore for decades. I like this lore here much more, and I find it more interesting than the story provided in Gold Road, where Ithelia is banished to another multiverse. Why go through all of the trouble to establish a character and then delete her and all memory of her just 1 year later? Again, I cannot stress enough, that was a terrible writing decision. But I wrote this without much thought after sitting here thinking about it for like 15 minutes, so I know it's not a perfect idea, but my point is that ZeniMax could have done much better here, and I think they should be held to a higher standard. Let me know if you like my version better, or if you would do anything differently. I don't want Elder Scrolls to become like the Fallout universe. Bethesda has destroyed Fallout's old lore in their last couple of games by making retcons that make zero sense. And to be clear, Elder Scrolls has had its share of retcons in the past, but Ithelia and ZeniMax's recent work really feels like it's on a whole new level for us. We shouldn't just be complacent when they do dumb stuff like this. Speak up, talk about it, and demand them to be better. I know the writers didn't intend to make a shit show of things, but I think entertaining the idea of Ithelia is honestly insulting. But you can all do as you wish. Anyway, here's my Daedric Prince tier list based only on overall enjoyment. Please tell me your favorite Daedric Prince in the comments below. Comments help the video's performance, and I like hearing different people's perspectives on the princes. If you'd like to stick around for further videos, please subscribe. Also, I could not do these videos without the generous help from my channel members, each of whom I value and appreciate greatly for deciding to dedicate a small portion of their income to support the videos and work done on this channel. Special thanks to Mental Reaper, Christopher Stobach, Person, Place, or Thing, Greg Gibson, Orkisney, Thin White Duke, Angel Garduno, The Frog Enjoyer, 80% Thoughts, My Maudlin Career, Willem Killian, Drad, Miroslav Zimmerman, Dudier, Ranger McKay, IDC Magna, Floofin, Jake White, Rasul, Jack Launder, Christoph Wenzel Zabore, Content Pill, Jarl Ulfric Stormcloak, Braden Thompson, Zucard, Rushfan217, Luke, Ilya J, To The Max, Alex McLaren, Friendly Trevor 95, Sterling Butte Curcio, Brave Fen, Celise, Silver Balls, Cintola, Ina the Khajiit, Peace, Sophie, British Rogue, Sequencer, Sir Ragu III, Brendau Almeida Santos, Omo, Jacob Waymo 22, Abby Normal, Marcus Strangle, Faust Lament, Alexis, Jake A.S., Soulless Saint, TJ, Ophelia Drowning, Skooma Addict, Breezy Stratton, Naji aka Tracy, Jug, Aaron Dobbs, Dishonored Pro 3500, OOP, Joel Evers, Debash, and Inherent Man X. If you'd like to become a channel member, there is a link down below with a video explaining the unique benefits, and you can also easily read them by clicking where the subscribe button used to be, because of course, you're subscribed to the channel by this point, right? Anyway, I've been Daraloth, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.